Welcome to the Los Angeles ACM SIGGRAPH 2022-2023 season. This presentation is Digital Art Los Angeles ACM SIGGRAPH times the EZTV CyberSpace Gallery, the second of 4 annual art shows, the 1990s. I'm Joan Collins, and I'm chair of the Los Angeles ACM SIGGRAPH and have been for quite a while. We produce 10 events per year and have been continuously since 1979. We are grateful to have the following distinguished artist presenters in this program, including Paul Brown, Karl Sims, Barbara Nessim, Roman Verostko, and Vibeke Sorensen. This presentation will be followed by an electronic theater of their artworks. We are honored to create this event with these presenters as a way of building a dialogue as well as awareness of ACM SIGGRAPH's role in the LA arts community. This annual art show focuses on work by current digital artists, as well as presentations of classical work. This is in collaboration with EZTV Online Museum and Michael J. Masucci, who's also our moderator this evening. Tonight is the second of 4, focused on the 1990s, but in 2024, for the fourth of 4, we're doing 40 years. Our digital arts community has paved the way for the world that we now take for granted. And reviewing these past milestones provides us with context to help us better understand the further innovations just over the horizon. Over the decades, both International SIGGRAPH and Los Angeles ACM SIGGRAPH have presented and or collaborated with a number of artists and art organizations, including multiple times with EZTV Media and CyberSpace Gallery. All of this information, including the artist bios, are up on our website. Visit lasigraph.org. This is the second of 4 annual art shows. Enjoy.
Paul Brown, welcome. It is great to see you again after all these years. You have graced EZTV on a number of occasions with panel discussions, sharing your work, and in many ways from afar, being part of our community for most of our lifetime. It's great to see you again. And as you know, this is a collaborative project between LA SIGGRAPH and EZTV CyberSpace Gallery that's going to be over the course of 4 years. Last year, we did a little bit of a focus on the 1980s. This event with a focus on the 1990s, although again, of course, not exclusively, and culminating in 2024 with a 40-year look back at many of the artists and collaborations between these two LA-based alternative art spaces. Paul, you've done many things. You're, in my mind, first and foremost an artist, but of course, you're a writer, educator, an archivist, researcher. I'm wondering how you see yourself. If you were to, like, in order, you know, name all the hyphens, how might you do that?
I would certainly think of myself first and foremost as an artist, and that's been the focus of my career since I guess my very late teens. However, I did spend a lot of my career in universities and art colleges teaching, and I did enjoy that. And ironically, because of attitudes at the time, computers were very unpopular. I ended up mostly teaching design students. And then I guess when it got to the 2000s, we still hadn't been recognized by the art mainstream. And I'd realized that if you're not recognized by the art mainstream, you get forgotten about. When you die, already some of my colleagues who were well known in the field, when they died, their relatives just put all their artworks on a skip and took them down to the dump. And so we set up a project in England at Birkbeck College. It was a 3-year project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is an official government body. And it was looking at the early days of the computer arts in the UK. And through that, we made a good relationship with the Victoria and Albert Museum. And as you may know, they later, with our help, acquired Patrick Prince's collection
Yes, I was going to
of artworks, and also the Computer Arts Society collection of artworks. And that became the foundation of the national collection of computer art. But that part of my life throughout the sort of 2000s was very much to do with making sure that the history was preserved and was documented and was being looked at in the right places in the mainstream art world. And it was a very successful project. MIT Press Leonardo published our book, White Heat, Cold Logic. And as I say, we built up this really good working relationship with the Victoria and Albert Museum, which continues to this day. And when our project finished, our project was called CAISH, Computer Arts, Histories, Contexts, etc. That was the acronym.
Just like to circle back for a second about the bias that was encountered by the so-called fine art world vis-a-vis computer. Did they ever, in your knowledge, articulate their concern, or was it simply technophobia, in your opinion?
All I ever heard was no. You know, you'd approach a gallery, you'd talk to somebody and they'd just say no. When I was a student in the 70s, I was a mature student. I'd gone to the Slade because they had a computer to learn more about computers at postgraduate level. And we thought we were going to change the art world. I mean, we thought we were the future. And of course, the next decade, we were completely unknown, and you know, people wouldn't even look at our work. And what I realized was that the whole new generation of young curators, art historians, had come into the field who'd been very influenced by the emergent ideas of postmodernism. They very firmly believed that computers were part of the military entertainment complex and were undesirable.
Oh, fascinating.
And they rejected computers, they rejected us. And what you've got to remember as well, which is very hard nowadays to think about, is that they'd never used a computer. You know, the laptop computers didn't exist. Universities just had one big mainframe, and the humanities students never even got involved in it at all. So they had no direct experience of computing either. So that changes in the 90s with the advent of laptops and the World Wide Web and all of that stuff comes along, social media begins, and then attitudes start to change. And of course, now we see, I think right now, Philips in London have got an auction of generative works with very high prices on the pieces. The major gallery in London had a show of the South American pioneers 3-4 years ago. So it has changed, things have changed.
What were there curators or any venues at all, galleries, universities, that were more forward thinking? Where were, as you and your colleagues were making the work, there must have been some places you were having it seen.
What we began to do was set up artists' initiatives, artist-run initiatives. And so I guess the one that is relevant to our conversation today was in 1980, was it? 81, Darcy Geberg and Ray Lozana put an art show on as part of SIGGRAPH. And that was the first SIGGRAPH art show. And it was not quite a formal event. It was in the courthouse opposite the convention center in Dallas, I think. And of course, next year it became a formal event. Copper Gilleth took over as the curator. And that was the beginning of this artist-run event, which was the SIGGRAPH Art Show, which became very influential for the field. And then IZEA gets set up, the International Symposium on Electronic Art. Ars Electronica gets set up. Herbert Franke is one of the founders of that. And then national things get set up. The Australian Network for Art and Technology, which I chaired for several years in the late 90s, gets set up. So what happens that this international network of artist-run spaces, together with the emergence of digital communications, email, all of that kind of stuff throughout the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s was those artist-run events, and the international network held together by Leonardo, who were very, very influential at that time. And of course, we're publishing the SIGGRAPH Art Show catalog throughout that period also.
Yes. With your own work, let's go way back. Did you begin in traditional media? How were you enticed to, dare to sit at a computer? And what was the trajectory of that?
Okay, I went to art school straight from school. I was 17, and I was doing a painting course, fine art painting, and I was very unhappy. Basically, at that time, this was 1965, and of course, I'd heard about performance art was coming along, and art and technology, and art and science, and light shows were beginning to happen, and that was where my interest was. I was sitting at home one night, and I did this drawing on the back of an envelope, and it was basically a systems piece where I simply drew a tile and then rotated the tile and discovered, you could do things, generative things. This is me speaking in hindsight. I mean, I wouldn't have even used the word generative back in those days. So I did this little drawing on the back of an envelope, and I looked at it and I was really impressed with it. I think what I say now is that it was in that drawing that I heard my own voice as an artist. I wasn't copying anybody. This was me. This is coming from me. And I think it was during that period I realized that a lot of what I was being taught at art school had been just nonsense. It didn't relate to me at all. And so I'm doing the light show, and then somebody comes to see me and says, there's this exhibition in London that we think you should see. It's you'll like it. And that was the Cybernetic Serendipity exhibition, curated by Jascha Rijkaard at the Institute of Contemporary Art. It was held in, I think, September, October, November, that sort of time in 1968. And that was also when the Computer Arts Society was founded. So I went down to see Cybernetic Serendipity and spent 3 days there. And for me to spend 3 days as an exhibition, it's never happened before or since. But I just realized that here was a tool. It was all mainly about computing. There was other technical stuff in there, but a lot of it was art and computers. And I just realized here was the tool that I needed. This was something I had to learn about. In 2018, the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, DC, were going to hold, with Leonardo, a 50th anniversary of Cybernetic Serendipity. And they were looking for an artist who was a young artist that attended and who was still working in the field. And as a result of that, I was invited to put on a one-man 50-year retrospective. And so it went from 68, the year of Cybernetic Serendipity, right up to 2018. Not a big show. There are about 12 of my pieces in there, which are now in the collection of the National Academy of Sciences. But that was a recognition, not just for me, but for everybody, of how important this event in London had been in 1968.
If for people just being introduced to your work today, the young people, if there was a short list of, let's say, 5 essential Paul Brown works that you really would want people to experience, could you articulate those?
I'm not sure. Two immediately come to mind, maybe 3. That drawing I made back in 1967 that got me thrown out of art school, that went in the bin at some point, but I did recreate it later. And so I think that's fairly important. And then what astonishes me when I look at that 1967 and look at what I'm doing today, I'm aware of how that idea has carried through. You know, I've just had this one idea that I've worked with really in the whole of my career, which is quite amazing. But there's a piece in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it's one that Patrick Prince obtained from me. It's a plot on paper. It's from 1975. And it's just called Untitled Computer Assisted Drawing 1975. And I think that's an important milestone, if you like, in my career. And it's been very popular. It's because it's in the V&A. I often get requests. I've got one just a few days ago to reproduce it in a book somewhere. And then looking at my more recent work with the time-based work in color, in 2003, I think it was, I was asked to produce a piece for an exhibition that was going to commemorate the centenary of the birth of Alan Turing, the computer pioneer. And so that exhibition, it's called Ingenuity and something or other, yeah, forgotten. That curated by Sue Gollifer and Anna Dimitriou, that toured England that year and went into the next year as this centenary exhibition for Alan Turing. And the piece I made was called Dragon. And that again has been a very popular piece. It was included in the show at the National Academy of Sciences. In recent years, I've been producing books. So here's one. It's called The Complete Grammar. And there's an internal page, if you like, from it. And it is actually a generative piece. So it progresses and it generates all the possible permutations of this particular set of objects that you see on the first page. And so every possible permutation of that are included in the book. And what's nice about the book is that it's a generative piece, but you not only can go forward as you would with an animation, but you can stop and just look at a page, but you can also go backwards and see, well, where did that come from?
Let's talk about the present and the future, maybe. You mentioned generative art a number of times, and clearly that term is no stranger to you, and certainly nothing new to you or to your colleagues, but it does seem like there are a lot of young people who think it was invented last year. Can you give any thoughts about the new sort of the new popularization, the new focus of digital art, generative art, NFTs, how you see it, how it's impacting, if at all, your practice, and where do you think it might go?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask that question because I'm old now. Later this year, I'll be 75. And I think one thing the conservatism of the art world teaches us that change comes from the young and not from the old. I'm looking with interest at present these text generation systems where you type in a sentence and this AI will make a picture based on that. Yeah. I've played with them a little bit and I've been quite impressed. I don't think it fits my practice and it's not something I would include in my canon of work, but it's interesting to play with. And I do know people that are using those systems to make some very impressive work. And so I think this is certainly something of interest. Artificial intelligences of some form will actually take over from humans, and they're much better fitted, for example, to explore the universe than we are. I mean, we're very frail creatures. We need to be on a planet to survive, whereas future artificial intelligences can go and explore the stars and the planets and things. And I think this is a very important part of our evolution to enable that to happen. One of the things that I'm looking at NFTs for is if I do a print here, I can send you the data, you can print it out, put it on the wall, and I can then mint an NFT as a certificate of authenticity. So rather than sign the work, because then I've got to be with the work and everything, I can send you that print, send you the NFT as a certificate of authenticity, and that signs the work for me.
Okay, thank you. Paul, are there other artists either at any point in your practice that you really feel if there were a short list, these people must be on them? I mean, I always ask a question of my colleagues, and I don't know that we're ready to answer the question, but I just like to say, you know, like, what are the masterpieces? What is the essential canon? And before we necessarily articulate or identify those works, I think maybe best first to identify the who's who. So who might be your short list of essential artists in your field?
Okay, well, I'll include Giotto and Cézanne, because I think in many ways I continue a tradition that they were part of. But if we talk more contemporary terms, I think certainly Viking, Egling's Diagonal Sympathy would be absolutely important for me, together with all the work that Richter talks about in abstract cinema. Larry Cuba is, I think, a major figure. And Sol Lewitt has also had a major influence on me. And in many ways, I can see some of my work is derivative of his. Max Bill. Max Bill was a student at the Bauhaus, and then after the Second World War, he set up the second Bauhaus. And he was an architect. He designed the building, but he also produced artworks and was a major. He redefined art concrete. The manifesto had been written by Van Doesburg, I think, in 1939. And Max Bill rewrote that in 1956, and his definition, I think, is really very good, and the work's very important. Mary Martin, a member of the, well, not a member of the systems group, I don't think, that they were affiliated with the British Systems Art Group, with her husband, Kenneth Martin. And historically, I was a student in Liverpool. And there's a big art prize in Liverpool called the John Moores Prize for Painting. And she entered a piece which wasn't a painting and won first prize, but because she was a woman and a woman had never won it before, and it wasn't a painting, it was actually a construction with mirrors, they had to appoint her joint first prize with Richard Hamilton.
Yeah, of course.
And so I forget what year that was, could be 69. But I remember going to see that exhibition. It was open to the public at the Walker Gallery in Liverpool, and seeing my own work, my own ideas in her work. And here was somebody who was absolutely in tune with my ideas. So Mary Martin's work had an amazing influence on me. I think it's been a very enjoyable conversation. I think you've asked some really good questions to bring out the answers that I wanted to give. So thank you for that.
Karl, it's great to talk to you. Thank you so much for being part of this project. You have been an inspiration now to several generations of both time-based and static image people who have seen that the digital image is becoming one of the most influential things that human culture has ever produced. And you are one of the authors in a way of the DNA that we now take for granted. And I am honored to have you part of this. You do so many things, Karl. I'm interested how you define yourself. Are you an artist, an engineer, a scientist, all of the above, or do words like that even matter anymore?
Yeah, I don't think they matter too much, but I think of myself as some of each. Maybe you could think of me as an artist that spends too much time developing tools rather than using them, which is, I enjoy developing the tools as well as using them. And then in some cases, the tools can be used by other people. So it's really a mix. I'm a tool developer, but I'm often motivated by work I want to do myself with the tools.
And you know, for those who may not already know, you are a fully realized computer scientist, programmer, code author, correct?
Yes, I write a lot of software. In fact, I write most of my own software that I use. Some of that software, I've actually sold. I started a company called Gen Arts and sold special effects software for quite a few years. And I've published some, papers at SIGGRAPH and so forth as well on the academic side.
Today, in the last several years, there's been a tremendous publicity, the term digital artist, which somehow mistakenly believe just began a few years ago. Do you like the term digital artist? Or do you just prefer artist?
So I don't mind it personally because it really is my medium, and it's relevant in terms of what I do with it. I think it's a little tricky because digital can be anywhere, anytime these days. And a lot of times it really doesn't make sense. But for my older work, especially, it feels like it accurately describes the medium, what I was doing.
Well, let's go back to your early work. In fact, let's, if we can, go all the way back to whatever age it was when one day you decided computers were of interest to you. And can you kind of like give us your trajectory, how you first stumbled upon computing, how you learned, was it formal, all of those things?
Sure. I think if you want to go way back, I would go to high school. And I remember my dad once brought home a Radio Shack TRS-80, which is very limited, but you could program it in BASIC. And I remember just right away thinking about making pictures somehow out of it. And I was printing characters to make pictures, ASCII art, you might call it, waveforms and whatnot, doing a Conway's life simulation, but then printing out each pixel as an X or an O or whatever. So it was very primitive, but I was, interested in making pictures from the beginning. And then later we had a teletype connected to a local college where they had a plotter, which was a lot of fun because you could do the, pen down, draw, pen up type things. And I remember making all these spirograph-like pictures with that. So again, it was right away making images while tinkering around with programming.
When you consider the creation of an animation, do you think of it like, as I say, a filmmaker would think, as that there's a story, even if it's an abstract piece? Is there an arc? Is there a beginning and an end? How do you see your animations? Because I mean, certainly some of them,
Yeah, I think
it ends.
ends up working better if there is some form of an arc. A lot of times it starts out as an experiment, an animation project. And sometimes that experiment can lead to a little bit of a story that has a beginning and an end. Other times a little less so, it depends on which piece we're talking about.
I spoke over you and briefly mentioned one of arguably your better known early animations, Panspermia, which we had the honor of showing at EZTV and I've seen many times in many places, dare I say, around the world. And I felt that was such a turning point in the history, and it encompassed so many different things, not just an interesting idea, humorous in a sense story, brilliant execution, but also I think spoke to the integration of scientific ideas, even perhaps controversial ones or not completely accepted ones yet, into arts-based practice. I wonder how were you inspired to make that piece?
Yeah, so I agree. I enjoyed making because it does bring together a bunch of ideas that I, am interested in. And sort of generally speaking, the emergence of complexity from algorithms is one of the themes in my work. And it touches on the sort of where do we come from, the origin of life, what's our creation story of our time, and that kind of stuff. But then underlying the images were all these algorithms that I used to create the animation. So the story of the animation in a way reflects the methods used to create it.
That's fascinating. And I mean, I'm sure you would agree, most audience members will not know that and they won't see that. But it's interesting how within the subtle subtext of your work, there are statements being made besides the obvious narrative content, that you're making statements in a sense about technology, you're making statements about your own evolution as an artist engineer, you're making statements about the evolution of the industry, dare I say. And I find that perhaps is something that young people would appreciate as they start to see, as they learn their history of digital art, computer art, the electronic arts, whatever name ends up sticking. They're going to see that there were subtle nuances of motivation in the work besides what ends up on the screen. And so much of it has to do with the fact that these first generations of computer artists were, in a sense, authoring the tools as they went along. And that in many ways, many of these pieces were not only what is on the screen, but were, in a sense, proof of concepts of technical innovation. Can you speak to that? How
Yeah,
that
no, I totally agree. I mean, in the early days, we had to do that. If we wanted to try something new, we had to work on the tools as well, which was, to me, part of the puzzle and part of the process. These days, there's so many tools that are amazing and available, that kids can create things, but they're not creating the tools at the same time. So it takes a little bit. It's a blessing and a curse. You can do things more easily, but you don't get to the point where you're really pushing new ground as easily and developing tools as easily as we could, as happened back then. They're further away from the algorithm, so to speak. Whereas in a lot of my work, the algorithms are really part of the process and part of the piece.
That's what I'm hearing. And I think that's so critically important in understanding your work and perhaps a handful of other of your colleagues who were, literally artist scientists who I remember one of the, I think panspermia actually was shown at EZTV, curated by Rebecca Allen, who we had do a guest curating once. And she's another person, I don't know how she would feel about this, but that I would call an artist scientist. She went to art school and then she went to MIT. And,
Right.
Even though we're much more interested in your whole story, the theme of this particular event is really the 1990s.
Yeah.
And for some of us, we feel that there were enough innovations and more like popular adoptions of things throughout the 90s that it really was a game-changing generation. I wonder if you agree. I wonder if there's any things that you think happened then that were, totally.
Yeah, so it feels like that to me, but I'm concerned that I'm biased because personally it was an important time for me because I was involved then and I was doing a lot of work then at SIGGRAPH and elsewhere. And it was a lot of fun because things were changing and developing and opportunities were presenting themselves. But it's hard for me to compare that decade with other decades because I wasn't as active in the other decades. So it feels like it to me, but it's hard to be sure.
But were there other like seminal curators or art historians or institutions or galleries or museums, people that you felt were really ahead of the curve, and if not just helping you, really early articulators of this voice and this movement?
Yeah, for sure. So there were definitely people and institutions that were super helpful in getting me going. SIGGRAPH being one of them. It was just a great community, both academically, artistically, everything else. So those were my people back starting in the 80s. And in 1988, I contributed Particle Dreams to the SIGGRAPH Electronic Theater, and that was my first animation that really got out there, and I was very honored to have it be the last piece in the show. And that definitely opened some doors and got things going, got me started in a great way. So SIGGRAPH is definitely one of them. I would also call out Ars Electronica in Linz, Austria. I went there a few times, and it was another great place to connect with artists. And they, supported my work in various ways. I had an interactive installation there, as well as some animations. The Pompidou Center in Paris, because they basically found me and said, hey, do you want to do an interactive piece? And I did. And that became Genetic Images, which was an image evolutionary interactive experience at the museum. And that was really a great experience. So I'll call out them. So at the Pompidou Center, Christine Vanache and Martin Moineau were the people that I interacted with, which got me to come there, which I appreciated. And at Ars Electronica, Christine Schopp was instrumental in helping me participate there and so forth. So, and then finally, I'll call out a local curator, George Byfield, who ran the Boston Cyber Arts Festival, and he got me to do several shows just in the area, which was nice to have some local connections.
So the Pompidou show seemed like a very interesting experiment in community building, and it obviously required some technical development as well as aesthetic and creative. Were there other projects that, in a sense, anticipated, predated, or led to what you ended up doing at the Pompidou?
Yes, so Primordial Dance was an animation which was shown at SIGGRAPH, and that was created using the same process of evolving abstract images. But in Primordial Dance, these images were animated by essentially interpolating the genetic information between one evolved image and the next. So it was a way of these abstract stills were pre-evolved by me by selecting from a set of random mutations and repeatedly doing that, but then putting them together and making an animation out of it. Whereas Genetic Images was presenting the process of evolving abstract stills at the Pompidou Center, so people could actually evolve their own abstract stills. So it was the same underlying technology for both of those projects.
Did you find, as some but not all computer artists and then digital artists found, that there was a sort of bias and a resistance against art made on computers by so-called mainstream institutions, or did you not experience that?
Well, I think, no, there was some of that, and some of it I think was even justified, right? Because people were all excited just because art was made by a computer. But then there's also just very new kinds of interactive art, which a lot of critics didn't want to call art because it was so different from what they were used to. So I got some of that too, and I was okay with it. If you push boundaries and people question things, that can be good, even if they're critical about it. It causes conversations and causes people to think in new ways a little bit. I'm fine with that.
I think in art-based practice now, I think there has been an evolution towards total acceptance of the kind of work that you just described. I think there is an understanding that art that builds community and the sort of empowering, allowing the general public to enter a museum space and create something is certainly building community. That one of the most intrinsic functions of art is just that, to build community. So I believe more and more, for lack of the $10 word, museologists, the more of them are understanding that they, if not required, they should be certainly encouraged to present more and more work like what the Pompidou gave with yours. There's room for all, but there's certainly need for that kind of work to build interactive experiences, to make the audience, to blur that line between the producer and the audience. Have you been keeping track or really paying attention to the other artists' work? Are there favorite artists of yours out there that you'd like to acknowledge?
I'm not so good about knowing what's going on now. I mean, I can go back in time and mention some of the old timers that I was impressed by and inspired by and so forth. Going way back into the 80s, I think. I mean, I can mention a few names. There's this guy, Larry Cuba, who did a piece called Calculated Movements, very early procedural animation, very simple, but it made me think, oh, you can use this stuff for more than flying logos, because that was where the money was coming from, advertising. But here's this guy that just did something that was visually interesting with algorithms. So that was great to see. And then a couple artists that did biologically inspired animations, Yoichiro Kawaguchi, this Japanese guy. He also had the best parties at SIGGRAPH, which was fun.
That's the truth.
And William Latham and Stephen Todd were inspired by Darwinian evolution. And they had some interesting work that I appreciated. And then there was this other Japanese artist that did amazing interactive pieces, Toshio Iwai. Just fun interactive stuff. Maybe some people might think it's a little simple, but I thought it was inspiring because it would just engaged everyone easily in a fun way. And I enjoyed his work a lot also. This
is a incredible story. I would dare to call it heroic. I think that, the early generations imagined a world that wasn't there, and they made it so, inventing not just a style, but inventing an industry. I have so much respect for you and your colleagues, and I am so thankful, and both EZTV and LA SIGGRAPH can't thank you enough. Is there anything else you would like to cover?
Well, I'll agree with what you just said. It's amazing what we were willing to do back then. Like to create Panspermia, I wrote the entire 3D renderer because I needed one and I wanted it to run on this connection machine, and there wasn't one. That would be unheard of now. Nobody would waste their time doing that. You just get one that exists and use it. But it was interesting. It took a lot more time, but it was an interesting puzzle to solve.
Can you look into your crystal ball and imagine art making 10 years from now, and then maybe 50?
Yeah, that's hard. I think one thing to note is that the digital revolution probably surpassed most predictions in terms of computing power and graphics power and what's capable. So maybe that will continue, meaning it's very hard to predict. I guess I'm hoping that it doesn't go the way of everybody getting sucked into some virtual reality world and leaving most of the real world behind. I guess, I'm an old timer and I don't appreciate that. There's great things that can happen there, but it can also, suck people away from the real world. Yeah. It's a balance, technology can enhance creativity in a big way. And I certainly hope that will happen more and more. But with any powerful technology, you have to be careful how it's used.
Karl, this has been a distinct pleasure, and it has actually been an honor to actually meet you. And I've known and admired your work for a very, very long time, and I do believe you are one of the people that helped author the modern art world. And
well, thank you very much.
My congratulations to you, and thank you again for being part of it.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Barbara Nessim, it's a sincere pleasure to have you as part of this show. You are one of the seminal voices in the cultural development of the world we now take for granted, the migration from the purely analog to the digital, and you live in both worlds. So we're going to talk today not just about your work as a computer artist, and a pioneering one at that, but also your broader work as a graphic artist, an illustrator, an art director, and how all of those art space practices working together make the unique artist that you are. And I'd love to now go all the way back to the beginning, when you were first starting, whether you were a child, whether you were a young adult, when you realized that you needed to say something and had something to say with visual imagery?
I knew at about 8 years old that that's what I wanted to do, that I wanted to be an artist. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be an artist or a dancer, but being an artist was on one of the top of my list. So I always drew when I was a child. And my mother was a blouse designer. We lived in a building of 88 apartments in the Bronx. And in the whole 88 apartments, there were only 3 women who worked. One was Marjorie Marshall, who was Penny Marshall's mother. And then there was Ann Lipkind, who worked with her husband in real estate. And then there was my mother, who traveled downtown on the subway every day, wore high heels, very fancy, and worked in the garment industry designing blouses. You always use your mother as a role model. And I always knew I wanted to be an artist.
So Barbara, your career path took you into a very early experimental situation where long before either the fine arts or the illustrative arts were routinely accessing computers, you got the opportunity to walk inside a room and add a whole new medium to your skill sets. Can you tell us how you first got interested and how you first got access to computers?
Well, my first introduction into computers was when Peter Spackman, who was then head of the council at MIT, the Council of the Arts at MIT, invited me to go up to work at the Visible Language Workshop with Muriel Cooper, who was head of it at that point and this is in 1980, in Boston. And called me up and I said, oh, that sounds so interesting. I said, what is it exactly? Because I didn't know. I think computers run big corporations, and I never thought of it as a personal computer or anything in that fashion. You know, you got your phone bill because it was a computer. You paid your gas bill because it was a computer somewhere along the line. But I never saw one, and I never knew anybody who had one. So when he asked me to come up there, I thought, okay. And I had just gotten married for the first time, which was in 1980. You know, my husband came with 2 daughters who were 11 and 15. So I don't know, I couldn't somehow say I do goodbye. We all lived together. So I kept saying, oh, I'm gonna come up, because it just wasn't an opportune moment. Somebody at Time Incorporated heard that I was interested in learning about computers, and Time Incorporated had a teeny little business, a kind of a startup. It was called TVIS, Time Visual Information Services, TVIS. It was on the 50th floor of the Time Life building. So they went up, and he was thinking, the man who was Dodd Sider, who was the editor there, was thinking they wanted to hire me, but I didn't want a job. I couldn't do a job. I was teaching. I was doing all different things. I didn't have time for a job. So I said, I'd love to learn about the computer. He says, okay, why don't you come up from 5 o'clock in the afternoon when everybody went home to 9 o'clock in the morning, and you can use the computers and teach yourself. So I said, okay, I would do that. So I had a pass, like I used to come up at 5 o'clock, and they gave me a book, a manual, like a loose leaf manual that was kind of 9 by, wasn't big. It wasn't, maybe 6 by 9 manual that, I had 2 monitors on a desk, and the whole computer part was underneath where you had the drawers for a desk, where there were no drawers on this desk. And there were a skeleton crew around. And so I had time to kind of teach myself. I would open the book and see I had 6 colors, a set of 6 grays. I had 6 drawing modes. You couldn't just draw. You had a tablet, but you couldn't just draw on the computer. You had to use geometric shapes and put them together and make things. So they had an arc. And so in order to get an arc, you would do Command A, Command arc. And then if you wanted it in a color like white, you could press the W key. And then you had your stylus, and you went on the board as an arc, 1, 2, 3, and it would make an arc. And it would, oh, and you had to say you were doing a line, not to fill it. So you would do Command arc, W, F for fill, and L for line. So it's a lot of like, okay, I wanted to, so I worked mostly in arcs, and I did really interesting work, and very much my work, somehow my work came out. And that's, the first thing I did was a car, you know, just to get a handle on what the heck this is. And then the second thing I did, I can't remember. And you had a Polaroid that came out as a Polaroid because it had a little CRT screen besides the big screen that you were working on. You know, the two screen, one had the information of the program, and the other one was a picture. And then you kind of like had to figure the whole thing out. So it was, all right, okay, I can make a car, and I can, so now let me see how I can fill it, how I can do it. So I taught myself with reading the book and just playing around with the computer, how to make something. And I started doing these very large, which are in my book, very large, you know, Cibachrome drawings. Well, first they were little, you could either have a slide, a 35mm slide, which doesn't exist anymore, or a Polaroid, which doesn't exist anymore in the same way that it did. And so I started doing these drawings. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes, yes.
Can you see that? That's
Absolutely.
made with arcs.
Yes, and
You see that?
the way you
Yeah.
described the technique before, you can certainly see how all of the figure is comprised of a number of arc lines.
Of arcs.
Yes, yes.
Of arcs. And then I could do a polygon, you know, which is on this side. But there are other ones. So that's a filled-in background with a lot of filled-in arcs with different colors. And it sort of was like a collage. Is that now in there?
Mhm.
It's sort of like a collage where things, what you did at the bottom was there, and then you put things on top of that, shapes on top of that. So I started doing these interesting, is that all on it? These interesting, this is a pattern. I had patterns I could do.
It's great.
So I kind of figured out a way to work that still kind of conveyed, you know, me. I mean, it obviously didn't look like anything I'd ever done before, but
Mhm.
I found a language right away, which was kind of interesting. And if I look back at it now, it's kind of interesting. So I stayed like from 5 o'clock to about 11 o'clock at night. I don't know, 3, 4, 5 times a week. People were angry with me because I was working with computers. I was going to upset their apple cart, or I thought that they would be so excited like I was. No, not at all. So it taught me a lot about human nature and how people don't want to change even if they're an artist. And I used to think artists are always interested in things, learning new things. You know, you're interested in things.
Switch gears if I can, and talk about an incredible woman who passed a little over a year ago, Patrick Prince. And Patrick is actually how you and
We
I
met.
actually first met many, many years ago. Patrick, among so many other things, most of which are much more significant than what I'm going to talk about, she was the co-creator along with myself and Victor and Joan and many of the other SIGGRAPH crowds were intrinsic members of this project. We created something within EZTV called CyberSpace Gallery. And in 1993, the International SIGGRAPH, ACM SIGGRAPH, the theme of the art show disallowed anything that was not time-based media. So the work needed to be animation or interactive. In some way, it needed to move. And Cyberspace Gallery put together a show called Digital Salon de Independence after the old French protest exhibition from a century before. And you graced us as being part of that. And Patrick, I think not enough has been said yet about Patrick. I believe that will change. I think in time, Patrick Prince will become seen as the seminal visionary voice, a very early adopter and appreciator of the significance of computing art.
I think Patrick Prince is a seminal figure in computer art, and even in art, because she was a curator. She understood what digital art was, could be, and she embraced it where many curators did not. And I think she is extraordinary, was extraordinary, and a very sweet, wonderful woman. And her husband, Bob, who was a programmer, was an amazing person as well. And I think a lot of those early people probably didn't get their due just because of the time and whatever. You know, if you're not a self-promoter, around the SIGGRAPH early shows, like Darcy Gerbart, Joan Truckenbrod, were figures in the very beginning of the art show. And then there was the artist David M., who I think was one of the people who brought excitement to the visual arts and in computer arts, and a very serious person. And I wanted to mention those three people because I think that they needed recognition in this conversation about SIGGRAPH and the early days of the SIGGRAPH art show. And Darcy Gerbart is now working with, I don't know, 4 dimensions. I don't know what they call it, but she's doing artwork that is sort of like in dimensional. You know, it's still on the screen, but it's really interesting as to what she's doing, you know, because she's taking it one step further again, because she was the only person, when I went to SIGGRAPH, my first SIGGRAPH, she was the only person that lived in New York. I didn't know, there was no other person that lived in New York. And I had never even got onto a computer yet.
And SIGGRAPH clearly needs to be acknowledged fully as one of the very, very first organizations that routinely did what it could to get the word out, admittedly at a time when most journalists ignored it. Art critics did not cover the shows. The mainstream press didn't cover the work, but the work did get archived, documented, and now there is the very real possibility that there will be a reawakening, and even projects like what we're doing here with this show is to try to, you know, shine a light on artists like yourself and all the other artists that we have the privilege of being able to talk to. As we transit, I want to back up to you've done so many kinds of illustrative work and many kinds of magazines. And if I'm not mistaken, you're one of those special people that can claim to have done a cover of Time magazine.
Yeah, and actually, how I got on the cover of Time magazine, I only did one cover for them, but it somehow became iconic somehow. And what's interesting is that they asked seven women, 7 women to do something, because it was something about the they gave everybody the same problem, whatever you want to call it. Do something about the women's movement. Now, the women's movement had already been around for, I don't know, 10 years. It was started, like, I would say, when Ms. Magazine first happened. Of course, it started earlier than that, and the suffragettes and, but the modern day women's movement kind of started with Gloria Steinem and Ms. Magazine, where, you had an actual magazine that you could read about women's things. And most men said, "Oh, what are they going to write about?" At least men that I knew, about taking out the garbage and cooking and cleaning. What else are they going to write about? Really, they really didn't understand what women could contribute, and what they only saw it as like a nuclear family and what a woman does, and what they asked 7 women to do something about the women's movement, and everybody did something, and they got paid $5,000 for each cover, and everybody got paid for it, but nobody knew what was going to be on the cover until it was on the cover. I didn't know they were going to choose mine, but they chose mine. So yeah, but it's just interesting because I chose a very broad range of it. I did a one woman's face, a big woman's face, and a staircase going through it where she was black and white. So it was talking about all color, all people. And then I had a little woman walking up the stairs, climbing to the blue sky above for the women's movement. So it was about all women, and she had the hair, she was in kind of a repose, and her hair was sort of like tears and hair, like they were a round thing. And what I had thought about when I was doing it, it's sort of like she's sad, but she's not angry. That it had to take this long. This is 10 years now for even Time Magazine to kind of recognize that there are women in Earth that can do other things besides have babies and cook and clean. And it will take probably 200 years to equalize. It's not that long. It's only like 50 years that, where it's 70, 80, 90, it's not that long, 40 years, 50 years.
So Barbara, with that, I think we're going to call it a day. And I am so privileged after all this time to really have gotten to know you. I wish it had happened back in 1993 when we probably just shook hands and not much more than that. But yes, the world that you were part of and Patrick Prince was part of, and Joan and Victor and myself and the whole LA SIGGRAPH and whole EZTV family was a much larger family too, that went into Timothy Leary's world and the poetry scene world and the music scene world and the film scene world. And nothing short of...
It embraced all the arts.
Exactly. And thank you for saying that, because that's the bottom line. And that's where really the history, I think, of digital art is that the computer has become the one-stop place for all of our efforts. Welcome, Roman. We are so happy, so pleased and honored to have you part of this project. You are a seminal voice in the history of what is now becoming more and more appreciated as one of the major tenets in all of art history. Work is being appreciated that's being done now, but you saw this world a half a century ago. And with the greatest of respect, I would like you, Roman, to tell us about your life, about your work, and about you as an artist.
I went to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh, graduated in 1949, and I wanted to be an illustrator like Norman Rockwell. In
Mhm.
those days, that was really something. You would have.
Yeah, it's
I noted here my most valued teacher, Vincent Nesbert, because he did the mural in the Pittsburgh courthouse during the Depression years when I grew up. I grew up in those years in the 1930s when he did that mural, and I admired him immensely. And this is one of my illustrations, be about 1948, 49. And for lots of reasons, I ended up joining a monastery and became a Benedictine monk. Now, it's a little bit of background, and then I'll elicit a response from you, just to say this much.
Mhm.
This is the Archabbey Basilica in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, the home of the oldest Benedictine monastery in North America. It was here that I executed some of my first murals that failed. I won't go into the details, but I wanted to point this out as background also. I was very much aware of Vasily Kandinsky's Concerning the Spiritual in Art, 1914, and Piet Mondrian's Plastic Art, Pure Plastic Art. I'd thoroughly read these works. I lectured on them. I taught the history of that, and I understood it. And the other, and what I would say is Kandinsky and what am I saying here? And Piet Mondrian, they both did pretty much the same thing. They were big contributors to the movement away from representing an image or another reality. Their paintings became the reality. And it took me a long time in my generation to understand that. And this is why seeing a visual form analogous to music in Kandinsky,
Mhm.
or seeing what Mondrian called dynamic equilibrium. And what did that mean, dynamic equilibrium? It meant he could take opposites, visual oppositions that in his plus and minus period, where the vertical and the horizontal are always, there is a tension between them. And he called that the equivalent, these were equivalent oppositions that he sought to get in his work, a dynamic equilibrium. He was after a universal harmony, a cosmic order, and he was, in his spirituality, he was a theosophist. So that gives us some of the base. And I also studied brushwork. I was influenced by Klein, there were a number of abstract expressionists whom I knew personally. So these are some of the ideas that came to inform my painting. Sunrise on West 34th Street. My abbot had sent me to study in New York. And as a consequence, I had a studio in St. Michael's on West 34th. And I could see the Empire State Building if I stood on the stoop looking down 34th Street. And my sunrise on West 34th Street isn't so much about the sunrise, but it is about how light and color in oppositions can create an active work of art. And this is just gathering visual ideas in my head as how to work. The transition from idea in mind, guiding the hand, to idea in code, guiding the machine.
That's beautiful.
So this is the beautiful, I mean, this is the way I came to do what I do.
Right. And that picture shows, one of the many things I would love to talk to you about is how you invented this modified plot printer that has an actual artist paintbrush on it.
Oh,
And
yes.
this notion of you bringing the knowledge of traditional art making to the computer and not simply abandoning, but in a sense, bridging the gap and creating a synthesis of it. And that, I think, is one of many of the reasons you're so important as an artist, is that you took with you, where you came from. And to this day, your work, I believe, is influenced by all of your experiences. And I have a question, if I can.
Yes.
There, to me, I would categorize you as an artist rather than a digital artist, because I think you are more than a digital artist. Do you agree or disagree? Do you consider yourself a digital artist, or
Well,
in broader terms?
I think essentially have always thought of myself as an artist, whether I use the burning the irons, doing the castings.
Mm-hmm.
I could go back to the copper angels. I've always experimented with different materials. One of my largest works is a 20-foot by 30-foot. I'll walk through this very quickly, but it adds to the different kinds of methods I experimented with. In the late 60s, if you lived in Manhattan and you went down to the Village, you would run into, you would end up in Andy Warhol's Velvet Underground. You would see people projecting slides
Mm-hmm.
with synchronized electronic systems. And I brought that to the monastery. And this is me in my monastery with on the left is a woolen sack tape deck with
Mhm.
2 tracks. And this is me photographing drawings. And I set up this method of projecting slides electronically synchronized to sound. And you can look at one on my website. They're very easy to hear the electronic sound. And we would seat students here. I had this photo of students at Seton Hill College, which is now a university. And my projection is floor to ceiling, 2 slide projectors and amplifiers with the sound. And it was kind of hippie stuff
Mm-hmm.
those days.
It's
It was
great.
a beautiful environment, and everybody, there was togetherness. There was a kind of we created an environment for an experience. And I believe this is some of the really important first electronic work that I did. I even tried to locate the original synchronizers, and I have them. I left the monastery, came to Latrobe,
Wow.
Pennsylvania, and one of the first things I did, one of my first experiences with the algorithm that could do graphics was at UNIVAC in St. Paul, Minnesota, UNIVAC. And that led me to have an experience with Tetra Corporation. I got to meet the engineers. I got to see them experiment with how they were going to proceed to make a circuit work and how all of this took place. This circuit was mounted and soldered together in Wisconsin at the same place where the first supercomputer was made. It's historic. So here's an example of brush and ink that I made by hand
Mm-hmm.
for my Psalms and Sound and Image. But this brush, and I know that that Victor's going to be very happy with this one. It's a robotic brushstroke, 1989. It's one of 125 originals that I generated from the very same parent code. And what that means is this. I don't know how they call things today, but in my day, if you created the generator, all one had to do is run it once, generate a piece, generate a brush stroke, change the seed, generate a brush stroke again, change the seed, and in a sense, it's exactly the same parent code. Nothing changed except the initiator. But by changing the initiator in a way, you could think of it genetically as being, what do you call it, germinated,
Mm-hmm.
if you follow me.
I believe I,
So
yeah.
this is the frontispiece for one of the 100 we made in the limited, that's a limited edition honoring the work of George Boole. That's, and if you look at it carefully, or no, if you look at these little circles I put there, these are the controllers.
Mm-hmm.
Everything I have done, practically everything I have done that was major since then. This is the curve is generated. It's called a Bezier.
Yes.
It's a non-uniform rational curve. So if you're in control of that curve, there's one hell of a lot of stuff you can do. If you know I can compute, I could have 1,000 controllers. I could have a 1,000 points along that line, along that curve, and I could remember them and know where they were precisely. And maybe before the day's up, I can show you how that works. Now, the complementary work on this side that's made with pen and ink, every pen stroke is exactly the same, but these pen strokes, I have rotated them in different sizes and different colors, but in every instance, one of them, every pen stroke is going to be attracted by one of these controllers. And for each attraction, it will draw itself scaled down, not less than and not more than such and such a given distance that I gave as the rule. So it throws dice for everything in between. That's the secret underlying this series here. This gives you an idea of, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is an end piece. This is an end piece. This is a frontispiece. There are 2 frontispieces. This is the one you just looked at. Here's another one, and another, and another. These were shown at Ars Electronica. Every frontispiece and every end piece in this edition is bound into a letterpress edition. It's a rare collection on George Boole's, a rare book on George Boole's derivation of the laws of thought. And in a way, the first edition, when this edition was pulled in 1990, the first exhibition was in the book, the library of the School of Mathematics at the University of Minnesota. This is what isn't well known to a lot of people, but George Boole developed his important work based on Aristotle's principle of contradiction. And that is a thing. It can't be and not be at the same time, in the same place, under the same circumstances. It's either going to be on
Mm-hmm. Or off.
off.
That's right.
Yes or no. This really, to my mind, wraps up what underlies the whole way, my whole thing. I still to this day meditate on these ideas that drove George Bull. And once you read his life and you learn about his commitment, he was an amazingly outstanding person. This is the new Fry Science and Engineering Center where I'm pointing. It was built in 1997, and I have a 40-foot expanse on the main corridor that includes a mural that you could look at it from this view. The distance from this end here to the entire other end is over 40 feet. The units measure 3 by 6 foot each, and they are pen plotted. This gives you an idea of the entire mural. I don't want to go through those details now. Let me say that there are 11. Watch this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 on the other side, and 1 central on this pilaster. If I click right here, I get an image of what I call a triptych. This gives you a bit of a detail of the triptych. And you'll notice this brush stroke and this brush stroke are viewed. These brush strokes identify the controllers that control everything that happens. One might look at it like this. If one would lift this brush stroke and this whole unit here, eliminate the brush stroke, lift this unit up and bring it over here and set it down, and take this unit without the brush stroke, pick it up, bring it over and set it down. This is approximately what you would get. And one of these one could look at the triptych as the genotype for the entire structure. These are pen plotted drawings, 3 foot by 6 foot. They are drawn with a pen plotter with a palette of 5 inks. I mix the inks with permanent casein pigments. I mix the inks myself. And my master program was the code that generated everything. So I have records. I have the code source for this entire structure available. It's written in GW Basic. It's hundreds and hundreds of lines. It took me years of work. And I undertook this in 1997. And every one of these panels was drawn. The brush stroke was made on my pen plotter as well. That was the original code. For the brush stroke became the controllers for the entire structure. So let me complete my triptychs. You do, Michael, understand that I would have to show you the code. It's hundreds and hundreds of lines.
Well, sir, we're going to wrap. I thank you.
Thanks.
Vibeke Sorensen, it's so great to see you. It has been a long, long time. Of all of the people in this amazing roster of people we've had the honor to talk to, you actually have participated in more EZTV events than any of the others. Quite a number Most of which, of course, have been in collaboration with LA SIGGRAPH. I mean,
Mhm.
off the top of my head, I remember you graced us by staging a multi-monitor installation, which you had installed at the American Film Institute in 1999. And then for the 35th anniversary, EZTV took over the entire West Hollywood Park. And we projected your imagery quite large on the side of a building. But you were also part of much, more, putting you on 25-inch monitors and putting you on a 6-foot projector. And so much of our DNA, along with LA SIGGRAPH's collaborations that we've done, had your fingerprints on it. And I just wanted to formally thank you for being part of those things and for believing in those shows. You yourself, like so many people, are a hyphenate, and I'm wondering in what order of hyphenation you might self-define yourself: artist, educator, scholar, researcher, activist, even in a sense, advocate for the field.
Oh my gosh. Well, I think of myself as first an artist, and experimental. I had, years ago when I was a student, I loved science and math, and I played the violin, and I wanted to be an architect because I thought it put everything together. And then organized information is another form of architecture, which is why I got into computing. Here was this new medium that ultimately could be moving images, films, sound, interview. I mean, it wasn't yet, but it was clearly going that way, and that it could be in the hands of the public, could be democratized if we got involved with technology development.
I mean, I would categorize you as a non-representational, abstract, experimental.
Yeah.
But is there within your abstract imagery, is there a narrative component that I'm
Oh, yeah.
Oh, please talk.
Well, you see, I always thought that I had these two sides because I did a lot of documentary work in the 70s, and then, I was always trying to combine animation and documentary. But of course, being a musician, because I played the violin and the piano and everything else, I, of course I'm interested in the reverie and the lyricism and the dream, but I didn't actually think of that kind of work as narrative until I went to USC, where, it's University of Southern California's School of Cinematic Arts in 1994, where, of course, narrative is really, talked about a lot and taught. And so after my discussions with especially Marcia Kinder, professor there, who I ended up working with on a number of projects, I came to a new definition. Narrative is the meaning we give to sequential sensory experience combined with memory. That's how the brain works.
Wow.
We're always interpreting things as a narrative. And so even if it's abstract, there's a narrative. Many of the structures follow a narrative, traditional Western narrative path. For example, it's conflict-based, and, and it leads towards about 2/3 of the way towards the end to an epiphany. And then there's a resolution, and often at the end, there's some new material. And this is, you might say that's quite common in Western culture. So when I teach about alternative narrative structures, it's different cultures, and how the music also is, provides alternative possibilities to our Western one. And so I've been working in my abstract work with those ideas, and a lot of those are very, very narrative. Those are narrative structures coming from, different traditions.
Were there other artists or curators or institutions, were there other colleagues in any sense of the word that you felt were seminal, indispensable exemplars that need to be part of this admittedly incredibly incomplete tale we're trying to say.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I just wish he was still alive. Gerald Grady, who founded the Center for Media Study that became the Department of Media Study at Buffalo. He was tireless in advocating for artists' involvement with technology and initially around film. He created basically the first electronic media study program in the world in Buffalo. I asked why Buffalo. He said it could be anywhere. I was brought back to Buffalo in 2007 as chair of the Department of Media Study that he founded. And I couldn't believe it. His archive was still there from like 15, 20 years earlier that went back to the mid to late 60s. Correspondence with hundreds of filmmakers and media artists, letters, and then there, when he brought them to teach, there's syllabi, what they were thinking of. Paul Scherritz, Hollis Frampton, Ed Emschwiller, Stan Vanderbeek. It was unbelievable. So that was transferred to the Rare Books Archive there. That's one of the things I did before I went to Singapore. But not only him. Of course, Ed Emschwiller, he was my dean at CalArts, and Stan Vanderbeek, who I spent quite a lot of time with, and Whitney, of course, John Whitney, I knew. Well, Gene Youngblood, of course, his book changed my life. I got that when it just was printed in 1971. And it was an expansion, not just of cinema, but of my mind,
What in our own feeble way we're trying to do with this project with Joan Collins, Victor Acevedo, and through the good graces of LA SIGGRAPH is to start a conversation we just start right off admitting there is no way we are even going to scratch the surface.
Yeah.
But we want to show how many tangents, how many narratives, many of whom have fallen through the cracks already. And I mean, I suspect that Ed Emschwiller will be remembered.
Yeah.
But some of the others, I'm Gene Youngblood, obviously that book has impacted so many.
Yeah.
But there are so many other names that
Yeah.
all of the people we're asking are bringing up that, oh wow, they're not on the list and they need to go back, and that we need this to be an ever expanding, continuing conversation, that we need to create a very fluid, dynamic database that continues to grow and grow.
Mhm.
At EZTV 4 or 5 times over the decades, I've done something often in collaboration with Joan and Victor called hacking the timeline. That there's already a history,
Yeah.
right? And I look at it and I say, wow, a lot of people not on that history. Wow.
That's right.
And so we're just trying to hack that timeline. We're just trying to stick things in, and we're not going to get it right, but we know we can get it better. And that's why talking to people like yourself, who are not only a witness to the history, but an author of that history, is so indispensably part of this ever continually written narrative. Let's go way, 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 way back. How did the computer first come into your life?
My art classes in perspective, because we understood that, there's the math of perspective, which I later taught. And then, so by the time I got to actually working with computers, they were first analog computers for, synthesizers in the 70s. But because I had the math from before that, I was always a little frustrated. I said, it's wave theory. I understand about waves. I can do that. I can build things, with them, but, and it's a 3D space. So it was really in the early 70s. The first time was in London at the Electronic Music Studios with Richard Monkhouse, and Tom DeWitt was part of a course there, and I met him. And Tom DeWitt made something called pantomation. and where he used a computer to actually send a signal out to a cathode ray tube that was combined in video.
Let's fast forward to today and perhaps the near future. The term digital art has become much more popularized, I would say, in the last couple of years, arguably because of an auction by an artist named Beeple, and suddenly
yeah.
whole NFT explosion. I wonder if you have
Right.
any thoughts about that, where it might be going, whether you're involved in any way, whether people you know, and any thoughts about this new sort of magnifying glass that's been put over the phrase digital art.
Wow, that's a big question. The short answer is yes, I'm involved with an NFT project, but for cultural heritage preservation as a way for people. There's a group called Quantum Temple, and they're working now with UNESCO and with my husband, John Stephen Lansing, who's an anthropologist. And the idea is to give back to the cultural protectors and creators of their heritage through the NFT Bitcoin chain, because of the way that it encodes the provenance. And I've been as well judging other festivals, and sometimes I see algorithmic work and look up that artist and I say, oh, that person's got, an NFT, he's got an algorithm making hundreds of these things and they're all for sale and they're selling. So I haven't done it with my own work. I do algorithmic work. I've got some movies like the Vishwaroop. I have 300 different versions of it because it's an emergent system. But I just, or I could write a new one and do something like that too, but I just haven't done it. I have some skepticism about it, especially with the Bitcoin crash and everything. I'm not really sure it's viable, but in principle, it sounds great because you have the provenance and the copyright and everything else, and you can go in the market and sell your work. And hopefully, the question is, how do you protect it? People at least can make a living from doing it, which for the arts, independent artists, is probably, not a bad thing.
If we were to do a short list of your career and maybe pick out 3 to 5 seminal exemplary works of yours, if you could only have a few pieces be remembered in the shorthand of history of yours, which would you choose?
What would I choose? Well, Temple, that first one that I made, well, it's a piece I made at WNET-TV lab with Rodetra. It's a performance of the machine. And I also composed the music. And it's about mind and meditation. So it has the elements that go through the rest of my work. It kind of, although technologically, it's maybe not the most sophisticated. It is from 1974, 75, and Temple and Tempest as well, because that's when I was working more with, digital, frame stores, even though it was a collaboration with myself, Tom DeWitt and Dean Winkler. It's my music, and it's also my eye, the image of my eye, and I was, of course, there, performing the devices. And then, let's see, of course, N loops, N for number, loops for loops, which gets shown a lot.
Yeah, we've shown that several times there.
Yeah, that one. And then in the 90s, Maya, even though the story is, I was making it, I was writing code to extend wavefront software, right? For compositing in 3D and stereo and all that. And I drove up to Wavefront, and I would always give them my images and they'd put them on posters and things like that. And I gave them a copy of this, and and the code also, because they could use it for their manuals. And my teaching materials I would give them, and they would use those for the manuals too. And that's how we got, a cheaper price on their software at CalArts. And so a few months later, after I showed them Maya, they released the new version of their software called Maya. Now, I can't say it's because of that, but the timing was pretty close. And it was the concept, the relationship between illusion and reality. I think Maya has a historical role, and it also pushed the development of a system that was used by artists, scientists, and architects. So I think that one, Maya. And then later in the 90s, Morocco memory, that piece, because I developed pure data software with Miller Puckett, the author of it, and a couple of other people, including Rand Steiger, who also helped with that. But that's the idea was to bring physical computing, video, networking, and other capabilities into the real-time computer music software. And the goal was the global visual music idea, where we extend the musical gesture to the visual domain. It showed that it was possible for the musicians to map their musical gestures to any parameter in the 2 and 3D dynamic image space. So, and we were doing that, we were having fun, and they always played fortissimo because they were so excited. So that worked. It's just that they didn't get performed a lot. Morocco memory, that was a installation you could walk into. It combined smell, the touch of, I call it the touch of light on the skin as you moved and interacted, and the smell, because it had spices. The idea was to put all the senses together with memory so that you could navigate and reconnect lots and lots of media materials. So you navigate the narrative. Morocco memory 2 is one of the pieces that I would suggest. It's 1999, and it was written up in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I think it's one of the reasons I was nominated for a Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship.
The work you're describing to me really does speak. It is the promise of what the merger of the human condition and the machines that humans have made and the tools that they've imagined can bring, and how we can expand and enhance the human condition through our tools. And I congratulate you for an incredible body of work.
Thank you.
The theme of this particular event is the 1990s, and
Right.
of course you quite understandably, which is exactly what we wanted, have gone back and forward through that. I'm wondering, at least I'll speak for myself, I think my colleagues agree, but every decade, of course, was pivotal. Every decade added something to the tool case and the information base that built this world. But it seems like in the 1990s, a lot of it came together.
That's
More
true.
and more access to personal computing, greater proliferation of networks, especially adoption of the World Wide Web. It seems like by the end of the 1990s, we were in a different world. And I'm wondering your thoughts of that.
Oh, yeah. From the standpoint of computer art, it was totally different. So it wasn't until the mid-1990s that it became more ubiquitous in art departments, at universities. And even though you had independent arts facilities that were extremely important everywhere. And a lot of that had to do, of course, with SIGGRAPH, people, and Pixar, and, a lot of this getting out into the public. And, finally computers getting cheaper, like people could have it at home, have them at home, sort of like cameras. And now, of course, people can make, young people can make what looked to be extremely sophisticated visual effects films just on their home computer. That was something that, in the 90s when I went to USC, we brought in, visual effects and computing, but, at that time in like 96, 97. And it wasn't just me, it was, like you say, the field. Jane Veeder did that. She's also someone I meant to mention. Of course, Jody Gillerman and Copper Gilloth and Darcy Gerbarg, and there's a whole, Bonnie Mitchell.
Vibeke, it has been a pleasure and an honor. I have felt that your contributions to our tiny little story have made us better, and I can't thank you enough for being part of this. And I hope someday we can meet again in real time,
Yes.
in some place, somewhere. But if not, I thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity.
All of the information on this and our artists and their bios will stay up on our LA SIGGRAPH website. We're coming up on a special treat that we have for you. It's our artists' electronic theater. you.